Hello, welcome, and thanks for stopping by. This is Gabriot, here with the fifth and final part to my Covenant 25 Divinity DLC Hellhorn Expert Guide. How's that for a mouthful? Anyway, and if this is like your first part of the guide, you don't really have to go back and watch the parts in sequential order. They're all kind of independent of one another. So, this might even be the best one to start with. Who knows? And actually, that's kind of a good idea. I think when I do my next guide, I'm going to do is Wormkin, and I'm going to probably reverse the way I did this. But that's neither here nor there. Let's get into this final part here, which is builds and strategies. Now, there are an endless amount of builds and strategies, obviously, in this game for any clan. But what I'm going to outline here is what I feel are the bread and butters. You can usually find some semblance of any of these builds or strategies in most of my builds when I'm playing Hellhorned. And it leads me to a pretty good win rate on Covenant 25. And y'all know me, I only go for Divinity. I don't count Seraph, under 100 shards runs as legit. That's just me. But anyway, let's get into it here. As always, chapter markers below. You can skip to any part that you want. Also, recently, I'll link it in the video description as well. I recently published a Google Sheet that allows you, if you're ever interested, to look at any particular card or unit or champ path that I've gone in any of my playthroughs. You can just search that sheet and it'll bring you right to the link of whatever you're looking for. So anyway, let's get into it here. First strategy is the overstacking strategy. You're probably aware of this if you've played this game and looked around, seen general advice. This is like the first thing they really tell you with Hellhorn. So why don't we just start with overstacking, right? So the idea here is that you basically can exceed your pip limit on a floor. You usually want to build up just one main floor, usually at the top, but it could be the middle. With Ascends at least. You could also, use a descend card to set up at the middle or bottom. But we're talking about Hellhorn, so most of the time it's going to be Hidden Passage. And then if you don't hit Hidden Passage, also Tiresome Climb can work as well, or an Old Magic. So basically, the idea is you put some units down. Hopefully you can put your tanks down first. That way they're in the front line on your top or middle floor, or whatever floors you're going to set up at it. And then you want to play the units that don't fit there below and then bring it up with Hidden Passage. And now the DLC has made this a lot easier to do with the adding of Intrinsic that you can add to the cards. That's basically you spend 10 shards and you can make this Hidden Passage be in your opener. Now I will say, generally I don't like to do that unless I already have a Permafrost or a Cheater's Hand. So Permafrost on the card or Cheater's Hand as an artifact. Because a lot of times you don't actually draw enough banners turn 1 to utilize that Hidden Passage, and then you kind of just waste it on your initial draw. So that's something to keep in mind there. Also another thing to keep in mind is Hidden Passage is a common. That white dot right there represents the rarity. Common cards are only offered in the first 2 ring awards. First 2 ring rewards. So that means if you don't get it then, you're not getting it. That's one thing to keep in mind. You might want to, not bank on being able to overstack. True, you might be able to find Tiresome Climb. You might be able to find Old Magic. You might be able to find some other clan's option, but I wouldn't bank too hard on being able to overstack if you didn't find Hidden Passage in the opener. I would try to maybe make a different strategy work. And that is pretty much the basics of it. Also, it's worth noting, a lot of these cards, like Hidden Passage, as Tiresome Climb especially, they're also pretty useful for just playing offensively on the enemies. It displaces them and whatnot. So it's not like you can take a Hidden Passage early. I wouldn't really take it unless I wouldn't take it over, say, a Ritual or a Fledgling Imp unless I really knew I was gonna for sure go overstacking. But if I didn't see a Rage card, I might just take a Hidden Passage just to leave myself the option of overstacking. Now, scaling wise, imps are not going to be what you want with an overstacking build. This is a common mistake I think I've seen with a lot of players that struggle with Hellhorned. It's like they know overstacking is good, they know imps are good, and then they're confused when they keep taking the both why they're losing a lot. Well, they don't work. Like, if you're going to go overstack, I wouldn't go these imps. Unless you're doing a 2-floor setup. But that, we're going to really try to keep it simple here, and let's really just focus on saying that these overstacking strategies are 1 floor. They don't always have to be, but let's just just to simplify how we're looking at this, we'll just say we're only looking at 1 floor. And in that case, Fledgling Imp, Roller Helper, they're not going to help you. They really aren't. As good as those cards are, they're just not for this strategy. So don't take those. And also, if you have them, since they're so good on their own, maybe you just don't go the overstack route. If you start with Fledgling Imp and no hidden passages, and you see a hidden passage come up, you might just want to not do it. You might want to really hunt for Endless on the Fledgling Imp, but we're going to get to the Imp strategies later. So instead, you want to focus on units and infusions that scale naturally. I call it passive scaling, so things like Slays, Strikes, Resolves, and Inspires, stuff like that. So, these are good examples here. You could infuse Alpha Fiend into your units that you're overstacking. Then every strike that it does, it'll get that damage. Now, multi-strikers love that, and sweepers love that. Go back and look at part 1 of this Hellhorn guide to really see the full list of what really utilizes an Alpha Fiend infusion. Also, something like Shard Soul Carver, also its infusion. The unit or the infusion is fine. When you're overstacking, these large pip units are A-okay, because you don't really worry about that too much, since you're obviously going over the pip limit anyhow. So, being able to inspire on that floor, also incanters, anything like that's going to be nice. Also, resolvers like Steelworker. Steelworker is really good. Gives you that nice defensive scaling to the whole floor. And if you have a few of them, you're getting even more per turn. And it can really get out of hand at a certain point, the more and more you overstack those. Now, keep in mind, you still have the 7-unit limit. That's something to keep in mind. Usually I find with overstacking, I rarely hit that, though. Usually I'm looking at maybe just 3 to 4 units, typically, maybe 5. And then also the single target spell scaling works pretty well for the backliner. But remember, some cases you might think to yourself, like, why am I overstacking, though, if I'm mainly focusing on just one single backliner? Now, it's still fine to do that. Don't get me wrong there. Like, you could just have overstacking simply for the Steelworker effect to get a nice big meat shield in front of your backliner, and then you still just focus on only offensively scaling the backliner. That's totally fine. That's a pretty common one with, like, full Brawler Hellhorn Prince or just some sweeper back there. But if it's something where you don't really have any passive scaling, and say you just bring up like 2 Animus of Wills that don't have any passive scaling, they don't have an Alpha Fiend or whatever, and if your only scaling option is like Ritual and Dark Deal, it might really not make sense to do that, because one of those Animus of Wills is going to be relatively useless. They're going to be there just as a meat shield, not a good one, and they'll do some damage, but it won't be much, even if you give it a nice initial upgrade like Large Stone or something. At a certain extent, most of your value is just going into one of those Animuses, so it might not be in your best interest to focus on overstack build in that case. But yeah, that's pretty much the idea there. Like, you can still, Ritual's just fine, Dark Deal's just fine. Just think about why you're overstacking. What value are you really getting from it? Branded Warrior Infusion also is a really good one here. That gives the whole floor rage. So those are some things to think about. And I did mention this a little bit before, but the intrinsic on your Ascend or Descend can be a good upgrade, but really you do want to get Permafrost. Or even if you do want to lock intrinsic on it, hopefully you have Merchant of Magics that you plan on visiting right in the next ring, and you hard roll for trying to get Permafrost. Holdover works too. It's not as good necessarily, but it means since it's intrinsic, you can play it and it'll come back, which is essentially Permafrost at the cost of a draw and an Ember, or 2 if it costs 2. So, that's why Permafrost is ideal in that situation, but Holdover works too. And alternatively, Cheater's Hand, right? You can just throw it away till you play it when you want it. And if you can't reliably put your desired frontliner at the front, you should also be on the lookout for cards like March of Shields and Vine Grasp, or on that same note, Cursed Vines, the artifact. Old Magic also can do pushing and pulling. And in some cases, even a Hosting Kin can work. If your backliner has enough health buffer, you could shoot the backliner to shoot it to the back. But really, like March of Shields and Vine Grasp are going to be your best friends there. Because, depending on how many banner units you are running, if you have a specific frontliner that you want, you might not draw it early, and it can be awkward to try to get everything to work. So things like March of Shields and Vine Grasp can be great there as well. And even in some cases, it's just nice to be able to shuffle your units. Say if you just had a floor of a bunch of Keeper of Echoes, for example, you don't really care which one's in front. You just care that the one that's getting damaged can be cycled out at a certain point so that a new one can come in and then you don't lose that first one. And to be clear, it's relatively pointless to make a floor of several backliners that don't scale passively, like I mentioned with the Animus of Will example. Unless your plan is to, I guess, like Steelworker infusion them or some other sort of passive infusion eventually. Like then you can do that. Or if for some reason sometimes you do just need a wide meat shield because you don't really have much defensive scaling options, that can work too. But in general, as I said, think about why you're overstacking. It's not always the best route to overstack, though it often is. And now we have some build examples. So this first one I have here kind of outlines some of the passive scaling that made this one a pretty nice one to do overstacking with. So we had two copies of each of these banners. We had the Alpha of Will, which basically every strike, it strikes 3 times, will get 5 damage. So roughly 15 damage a turn. Against Divinity, you definitely get 15 damage a turn. And with a Steelworker, which was then infused with another Steelworker, and with the Railhammer, I'm basically getting literally a million armor a turn with 2 of them up there. So defensively, we're good. Offensively, when you combine that with, the supplements of like Ritual of Battle, even the Sharpen here was okay because I had the Gnarled Root. You're sitting pretty well. This was a pretty nice run. And then obviously I had the Permafrosted Hidden Passage. It's fine to permafrost. It's always going to be fine to permafrost Hidden Passage, even if you don't find Intrinsic. That way, if you do find it in your opener, it's not wasted. Also, past a certain point, once you have your floor built, you don't really want to be redrawing Hidden Passage. So in that sense, it also kind of pseudo helps it not. It pseudo removes it in the sense that you don't keep drawing it. So permafrost is a very good Hidden Passage target. And I also had the March of Shields because, as you can see here, often I might just draw both Animus of Wills. And I really wouldn't want them in the front, so eventually, if I could bring them forward, all the better. I also had a Vine Grasp to supplement that as well. So this was a pretty clean deck. Like, there's a lot of options here that support each other. I also had the Wildwood Tome to help further prevent damage, though, honestly, with the amount of armor I had by the end, it really wasn't needed. And then onto the next build here. Here we're going with a kind of a Rage-tastic build here. Not as much passive scaling necessarily, but as we've mentioned, it doesn't always have to be that way. I can have this dedicated backliner, which in this case was the Horned Warrior. He got an extra multi-strike from Animus of Will on top of its natural multi-strike and a Frenzy Stone multi-strike. Had extra survivability so that he could get down, and that's another thing. Even on your backliners, I generally like to add at least 25 health or sometimes large stone to them because they really just want survivability, especially in an overstacking situation where often you kind of have to play them naked as in they don't have the tank in front of them, either if they're on the top or the mid just waiting for a hidden passage to be found or whatever ascend card you're looking at. So it's always nice to add some health onto them. Just in general, it's good against spikes and sweepers too. And then we had the Deranged Brute, which hyper scales the rage that we have of these 3 Ritual of Battles and the Last Stand right here. We also had an Impish Scholar to bring the Last Stand back once, if we were lucky enough. I didn't always be able to do that, but sometimes we were. We also had like Channel Song to help get people out. It's okay in some cases. And then there's other things like the Shattered Shell there. Sometimes you go for things that don't necessarily work out. Like this Shattered Shell, I probably had locked in like Quick before I had found Quick on the Wildenton. But once I found Quick on the Wildenton, I was like, well, I might as well put it all in. And then I just never really got around to removing Shattered Shell. That's totally fine. Sometimes you just have throwaway units. And honestly, it's probably this card was still probably doing stuff, right? It was still probably helping with the AOE situation. But really, this is a good example of one that really doesn't have passive scaling. Technically, Shattered Shell passively scales, but not really in this situation. Like, there's probably plenty of times it wasn't getting that many slays. Really, it was just place Ritual Battles onto Horned Warrior, overstack people up into the floor, have everybody quick with Wildenton so we prevent a ton of damage. You'll notice we don't necessarily have a ton of defensive scaling. Really, our defensive scaling is just adaptive mutation, right? Adaptive mutation, whoever I end up playing that on is going to, if there's enough rage, they're going to get a huge health boost along with another damage boost. It's pretty nice. That's pretty much this build. Now we go on to another very common build, and this is common across all clans, but this clan's probably the easiest to make it work on, the tank and spank build, or strategy. This is the most basic strategy in the game. Any new player, I would just focus, I would say focus on this no matter what combo you're running. Now the strategy here, usually you don't really need overstacking here. You could. You notice that last build kind of was a tank and spank as well, but sometimes there's overlapping between these strategies, but tank and spank really doesn't need overstacking. Really, the basic baseline here is have a good frontliner that's pretty meaty, and have a good backliner that either has multi-strike or sweep or trample. Some one of those, any one or more of them is going to be great, or at least like a buff to add multi-strike or add trample or something, a buff card spell, so, and it can be supported by either imps or your scaling spells, or both. Sometimes you do both, but it really depends on your pip situation, obviously. So if you went with a fatter tank, because a lot of tanks are 3 pip, not all, I prefer the 2 pip tanks because of that, but sometimes you don't have that luxury. If you don't have pip, then it's obviously not going to work to use imps. You might take them if you think you can get through the first 3 rings fine, and then take a pip upgrade. That can work sometimes. But you really have to gauge what your situation is. And generally, I already said this, but the spanker wants to be a multi-striker or a sweeper, typically. And also, you're not always going to have that luxury, right? Even in the case of, say, a Horned Warrior who's a plenty fine backliner, sometimes you're not going to find an additional multi-strike, so he's only just multi-striking once. That's still not really going to be enough to get through Divinity on its own, even if you scale him up a ton. So if that's your situation, sometimes you don't even have multi-strike at all, right? You might just have a single striker, and that's what you're stuck with. It happens. All is not lost. Be on the lookout for things like Inferno. The reason of that is, the Divinity fight in particular, there's several waves where there's 3 tanks. And Inferno can do a really good job in both killing the little squishies on either side of those tanks, and then also just getting the health of those tanks down. It might get it down enough that whatever your frontliner is, because often, your frontliner tank isn't always just a meat shield. A lot of times it's a unit that can still deal damage, right? Like, say, like Siren of the Sea can work as a frontliner, but, I could easily have like Siren of the Sea as the frontliner and Horned Warrior as the backliner. In that case, my Siren of the Sea still does have some offensive scaling, and even if it just has a single strike, with a combo of Inferno, it's probably able to kill that first tank, and then Horned Warrior can clean up the other final 2 tanks, right? So Inferno is very good there. If not Inferno, there's still other options, Vent, Crypt Builder, any sort of spell removal, even a Hornbreak. Be adding those spells, because scaling can only take you so far if you don't have sweeping, trample, and a bunch of strikes, right? And obviously, these are some good examples of the Spankers: Horned Warrior, Husk Hermit, Animus of Will, Full Brawler, Hornbreaker Prince is a great one. Gurg's Goat is going to help basically any demon turn into a nice backliner. And then your frontline good examples would be like Rail Beater. That's a great one. It preps your backliner to get a nice first hit in. It just has a lot of good tank stats, and it has 2 pip. Thorned Hollow, you could replace any hollow here, really. It's okay. I don't love it because of the 3 pip, but if you have any amount of heal, it's going to like clear out the backliner, the squishy units with its spikes, typically if you put enough spikes on. And it's just going to have some nice health. And the Awoken Hollow, in comparison, is also pretty fine. It gives nice scaling to your backliner instead of spikes. Either one's fine, and they have a lot of health if you can, make up for that. Make up for that with a big heal. Also, the Deranged Brute is a great one. It's a lot of times it's just a totem on the floor, but it doesn't need to be. It can serve as the tank. It can also serve as a damage dealer too, honestly. But most of the time, if I'm using it not as just a totem, it's probably going to be a tank, because I usually have something that hopefully has a multi-strike or sweep that I can put on behind it. And then it already has 25 health, which isn't horrible. It's not super great for tank stats, but typically I would say maybe you could combo it with since you got the low pip, you could always chump block something in front to cut out a little bit of that damage. And that might be a good situation for adding some health to your chump blocker too, typically an imp or whatnot. And obviously, you want good scaling to put on your spankers like Ritual Battle, and also typically some good scaling defensively to put on your tanker. Alloy being an example, but there's a whole plethora of options there. Heal, stealth, whatever. Tank and Spank can also work as a 2-floor setup, especially with a champ like Shardtail Queen, where she just sort of naturally is able to clear waves, at least the lower health enemies, and in a way she's almost like an Inferno every turn if you have Imperialist. She essentially she kills all the squishy stuff and weakens all the tanks, and then you can just have a Tank and Spank. Why do I want to say Tank and Splank? I don't know. But anyway, you have, the Tank and Splank 4. Tank and Splank 4. Yes, up above. And it's scaling to finish off those tanks, but more importantly to finish off the bosses, because Shardtail, outside of some really nice, Transcendimp, Shardtail can probably just solo everything in the game, but if she doesn't have Transcendimp, she's probably not your answer to the boss, right? It also is nice because typically with Shardtail, specifically, you're taking pip upgrades, so that can make it less awkward to set up your floor, because now you can take a 3-pip tank and even add like a large stone onto it, or even add the large stone to your backliner at really no cost of awkwardness. And you could even fit, if you have extra imps that you aren't using on the Shardtail floor, you can even throw them up top if you have extra space. Just help with the scaling, help with the chump blocking. It's pretty nice. But again, really try to determine what your likely strategy is going to be as early as possible. So we've said imps can work for this. Also, just spells can work for this. Imps won't always work for it. So let's say you already have Fledgling Imp early, either in your opener or you found it ring 1. It's such a guaranteed win, and we'll get a little bit more into Fledgling Imp, that you're really inclined to hard hunt for an endless option. The most straightforward one is going to be the Merchant of Steel Endless upgrade, but there's other options. There's the Melting Remnant Reform. There's also caverns where you can find the Melting Remnant Endless Tome. There's infusions such as the Vetivery infusion. Even the Transcendimp infusion sometimes can be okay to put on it. But really, if you find Fledgling Imp, you might as well try to plan on using it since it's just so good. And in that case, you want to focus on trying to get a 2-pip tank. You don't want a 3-1, because then you're just not going to be able to play that imp. And you're going to be forced into taking pip upgrades, which isn't always the best. And even if you do take pip upgrades, you want that pip to be for extra imps rather than just a fat unit. The fat unit, I would much rather use that if Ritual of Battle is like my scaling option. That way I don't need that extra pip, and I can just focus on, playing the spells in the backliner and whatnot. And there's, I touched on this before, but there's a wide variety of defensive scaling options, not just armor, not just health upgrades. It can be, it could even be debuffs to the enemy, like dazing them, sapping them. But like Molten Encasements on Endless are amazing with stealth. Lifesteal can be great. Damage shield stacking, regen stacking, and honestly, sometimes in the case of stealth, for example, you may not even need a tank. You might just go full Spank, right? If you have an endless Molten Encasement, why do you really need a tank at that point, right? And but on that note, don't neglect one or the other, offensively or defensive scaling. You can be skewed in one direction, and that's probably fine if it makes sense. But if you completely ignore one or the other, you're gonna get bit, most likely. Like for instance, offensive. A lot of times you'll have such good defensive scaling that you crush the entire run because nothing really can stop you, because you'll clear the waves well enough, and the bosses are all relentless, so you never have to deal with having to take on something that has as much health as those Divinity mini bosses. And then those Divinity mini bosses are going to get you by surprise, because you're going to quickly see that, oh, I was able to survive everything, but now I have this fucking 1,000 health unit that I have to kill in one round, and it can't be done, right? So you can't neglect offense in a case like that. And alternatively, you can't really, a lot of runs, let's say you got a quick sweeper that's just sweeping everything and killing everything, right? You'll crush the run, but maybe ring 5, you get the stealth boss, and then you get caught with your pants down, That sounded wrong, but you know what I mean. You basically just don't have the defensive scaling to sort of survive a few rounds of just not being able to attack the boss, right? And then you just die, and then you're sad. But let's go over some builds, typical of the tank and Spank. So I did mention earlier, like Siren of the Sea can work as a tank, can work as a Spank as well. It's just as good as a tank or a Spank. Sometimes you can be both, right? But in this case, it was a tank. But the nice thing about this tank is it can Spank a little bit, even with just one strike, and a not necessarily super incant-oriented deck. With my endless Fledgling Imp, infused with Fledgling Imp, that's getting me 10 rage a turn. So that on top of incants, she'll hit hard enough, and then the 5 striking Hornbreaker Prince behind is the real Spanker. And that Spanker is going to take out all the floor, right? Because this is a good example of one where Fledgling Imp was possible along with Ritual of Battles, because my tank is only 2 pip, my champ is only 2 pip, so I have the luxury of, right from the start of the game, I can fit a Fledgling Imp in front of them, chump block some of that damage, get scaling the whole floor. I even end up taking an extra pip upgrade just because I had found an Impsicle, and it was nice to also play another Imp on the floor. So if you look here, it's like Siren of the Sea just naturally has defensive scaling along with the, it has the health scaling, but it also has the added armor scaling. She doesn't have to scale as much because I'm getting 1, probably 2 chump blockers every turn. On top of that, I have, and by the way, I also have the important work on holdover spell chain, so this is getting me actually 30 rage a turn at that point. And then I also have things like Spike of the Stygian and Drain to really mitigate the damage coming in. Another Drain there. I did have a hidden passage here, but this was like a good example of one where I really didn't use it. Like, this was not really used to overstack. If you see this build, there's really just no overstacking going on. It doesn't want to be over the pip limit because it wants to play imps every turn. Wildwood Tome, also putting that on Hornbreaker Prince is going to prevent a ton of damage. And had the Tiresome Climb and holdover, like we said, stacking Dazed on bosses or just some heavy-hitting enemies is a great way to mitigate damage. And then I also had the Rituals on top of the Fledgling Imp with a Consume Removed Last Stand. So this was a super, super well-balanced deck that really didn't have much problems. And then here's another one. This is a nice the Guardian Stone, Guard of the Unnamed is our tank here, and this is a good example. You know that Siren of the Sea is a tank that can spank. This is not a tank that can spank. This is a tank that can only tank, which is fine. If you got enough spank, you can be fine with a tank that just tanks. Because we had kind of still the dedicated spanker was Hornbreaker Prince in this case, but we had a supplemental unit here that would take out all the squishies, which was this Cold Kalia, and it gave passive scaling to the entire floor, which was quite nice. And since we microstoned the Guardian of the Unnamed, we didn't really have to overstack. I probably had the hidden passage there to overstack at one point before I found that microstone, but then it just really wasn't needed. So it is worth noting that Tank and Spank can overlap with overstack. It just often doesn't need to. But yeah, basically Cold Kalia with that Branded Warrior infusion, every kill it gets, which is usually going to be those squishies, is just going to give rage to the entire floor. Really help. And then I also had 2 double stacked, double cost reducted Ritual of Battles to just slap on Hornbreaker. And honestly, Cold Kalia would want at least 1 to get going, because it starts at 1 damage. She didn't have any... She had the 7 rage, but by the time Divinity rolled around, she probably wanted at least 1 ritual to get going, so that's totally fine. And then otherwise, I have the Tiresome Climb is always great. Very flexible card. Battering Ram, since I probably had a lot of, obviously, armor from the Guard of the Unnamed, Crypt Builder, so on and so forth. I had another ritual here, too, that wasn't double stacked and was just cheap. So that's a nice, pretty bread and butter Tank and Spank Dark Deal as well. A lot of nice buffs to put on Hornbreaker, and one of the better tanks in the game, which is Guardian Unnamed. Also, it had the Guardian Stone, which gave armor to the entire floor. Because remember, your backliner still is going to need something, especially if you're setting up top floor, which often you are. You want to be on the lookout for dazed, ways to get his health back. Because even if you daze everything, there's still spikes. Spikes are going to wreck both the Sweeper and Hornbreaker Prince, so you want options there. And then another Tank and Spank a Tank and Spank build here. This is more along the lines of that sort of 2-floor setup I was talking about, where you can have Shardtail on your own floor. And this isn't even necessarily the best version of Shardtail, right? This is just full Imperialist, which is probably what I didn't want it, but I was locked into it because I probably never found Imp Parade, right? Typically, you'd want Imp Parade 2, Imperialist 1. That's the best combo for her, I'd say, in a setup like this. That way, she doesn't spend any Ember to play her Imps, and also just provides free Imps every turn. But this is fine still. Full Imperialist gives her nice initial stats, and she can just blast things out. So she was down there clearing out waves, and then I just focused on a main floor with... I have the Horned Warrior ×2. So actually, this is also another... you can also flex here. Like, I probably had Horned Warrior... I had some flexibility here, right? I could use the Rail Beater as a tank top. Or I could... It depends, wherever the tank made sense. I was probably flexing it in and out of each floor here. But the idea is, this will be your tank, and then I had these 2 Spankers, and I could put that Spanker with Shardtail Queen and the Rail Beater, so really get that 2-floor setup going. Because, Shardtail is getting the Fledgling Imp every turn, getting that Rage every turn, but then I also have the Ritual that I can play on the top floor on that Horned Warrior. And there's probably some times when literally just the Shardtail floor alone was probably enough. But it was nice to have the option, of course, to have that finisher floor up above. And the nice thing about this Morsel Maker infusion is that they'll keep scaling passively as well, without the need of relying on rituals all the time. And then this one, this is a brief strategy, but it's worth noting that there's this endless Transcendimp strategy. Basically what this does is, this is a strategy that forms later on in a run. You're usually going one of your other strategies before you find this, and then you just abandon that strategy once you can make this happen, because honestly, I thought this was worth mentioning, because if people don't know it, you're throwing away free wins, essentially. This is one of the freest ways to win in the game. is to put any of these infusions, particularly Queen's Impling, but Molting Imp and Fledgling Imp are fine too. If you put that into the Transcendimp, and then if you find Endless on it, or some variant of Endless, pseudo-Endless, you will win the game. And plus, remember, the final floor always has at least one Hell Vent guaranteed. So all you really need is that Endless thing with any of these infusions, and then Hell Vent it at once. And if you can combine, especially if you can find important work to work with it, but if you don't find important work, just ways to make sure it's dying, like, especially if it's like Queen's Impling, it'll eventually be clearing out the entire waves. It'll still be fine against Divinity, because Divinity will always attack it, but any non-patient variant of Seraph, you could run into issues if you can't sacrifice it, so you will want a way to sacrifice them. The easiest is to have Melting Remnant and just have Burner 1 upgrade on it, but there's other great options like Important Work, Hornbreak, obviously any damage spell that you can target your own units with, and also any sort of imp synergy spell, like Impressive works as well. But yeah, basically the idea is if you can find Endless on it and you can have a good infusion into it, that will carry the entire game by itself. You don't even need a champ. You don't even need banner units. It will literally kill the entire end game by itself. Literally, like just 2 Transcendimps, Endless with the Queen's Impling transfusion will definitely kill the entire end game, as long as you're not kind of messing up by not having them die each turn. If they're not dying each turn, then you're probably going to die. Well, you might not die, but if that's like your main strategy, at that point, you're going to be in trouble. So definitely make sure you don't mess up and leave yourself without a way for them to, get played every turn. But like Important Work will pretty much be good enough alone for that, if you found that. I have 100% win rate with Important Work, by the way. Just throwing that out there. And I'm only having one build example here, so basically just illustrating that, like, initially I had kind of a tank and spank here going with the Husk Hermit, and it had Rituals of Battles to put on it. I even had invested in a Endless on the Ritual of Battle. It was behind the Sentient. It was multi-striking. That was probably going to win the game anyway, but why not just guarantee the win? So once I found Transcendimp, I just abandoned everything else and just let Transcendimp kill everything. You'll notice here the score is 70k. Guarantee you that wasn't Husk Hermit getting those flying kills. That was Transcendimp. I only needed 2 in the important with the Important Works on Holdover and Spell Chain. That was just GG. Machine gun firing, eventually just killing both Diligent and killing the Divinity without any need of any other card. Just that and Important Work was all I needed. Then there's Fledgling Imp Carry, talking of imps. This is probably one of the most bread and butter ways to win in Divinity. I mean, this unit has gotten so much more powerful in the DLC. Like, it's just the unit itself already went from 3 rage up to 5 rage. It was already pretty okay at 3 rage, but at 5 rage, I mean, that's 10 damage to your whole floor. And if the infusion gets the full value too, you can infuse it into itself or infuse it into other things. There's a lot of flexibility with what you do here, but the idea is you take Fledgling Imp or infuse it into something and make it endless. And it can work with tank and spank, but also, if you have something like a molten encasement infused with it, you don't really need the tank. You can just get the spank, and at that point you can just line up a bunch of these, or just get multiple spankers, because you're getting wide scaling, and just have at it. The defense is taken care of with stealth. And this build loves pip upgrades. The more of these that you can fit on a floor, the better. They're often just chump blocking. A lot of times, even the imps themselves, past a certain point, can serve as a nice just source of damage. And you're getting a lot of damage, and even more when you start adding in things like Important Work. You can get Last Stand. You could even, I've had it where I have Fledgling Imp, I put an Impish Scholar into it, get it endless, have Last Stand. You get insane amounts of rage at that point to the entire floor. It's pretty hilarious. Even better if you can cost reduce that. and just, there's a lot of infusions that work with it. There's Molten Encasement. You could even do Welder Helper. That's a fine one. You can still play it front. It will get, 20 armor to itself while providing 10 to the rest. And then it can basically chump block. Usually by a late game, it's dying every turn still. And then you're stacking 10 armor to everybody, even more if you got like Railhammer. And obviously, important work is always going to be really high value with any of these endless imp type builds. So some examples of the Fledgling imp carry. In this one, I put a Molting Imp into it. The nice thing about putting Molting Imp in is like, you're sacrificing maybe some extra scaling offensively to really help with defensive scaling. If you're guaranteed to basically kill almost all the backliners, the only backliners at this point that could survive a 15 AoE would be those final 3 rings. But notice here, I started right from the start with double summons. So I, knowing that I could find a Fledgling Imp, I believe this run I started with 2 Molting Imps and then found Fledgling Imp pretty soon. Knowing that I could do 30 damage with this a turn, then those will kill pretty much all the backliners, even in the late game. So I figured it was worth it. I saw Seraph the Temperament. Keep in mind that's going to have a lot of Shade Wings, so it made a lot of sense here to do that. I also did find a Transcendimp later, but we didn't go into the sort of abandon gameplay at that point because I didn't have, since I'm non-exiled Hellhorned here, I didn't have the luxury of having a Queen's Imp to put into it, and I just didn't have any other imps to infuse with it. But it's still going to be great, right? I did find Endless eventually with it. Even just with that, you're fueling it up every turn with these Endless Fledgling Imps, and then eventually you can just fuel them with that as well. So you're just getting a ton of rage there. And then this essentially overlaps with the tank and Spank. I had a Tethys on the floor, I had a Siliphied on the floor. That's 2 sweepers that are getting a ton of rage. You'll notice I did not have Multi-Strike. This is one of the many no Frenzy Stone runs where honestly it wouldn't have been a hard run, right? And then I had Guardian Stone to supplement some armor because even though the AoE clear helps mitigate, the AoE clear on top of the chump block helps mitigate a lot of damage, you still need some sort of defensive scaling, so Guardian Stone does a nice job at helping with that. And also Frenzied Swarm would help probably a little bit with that. And then we had some heavy hitters like Crypt Builder just to help especially with like the mini bosses. It's possible even with this I might not have been able to scale up quick enough to just kill the mini bosses, but Crypt Builder would pretty much guarantee that. So that's that build. Another Fledgling Imp carry build here. This is maybe even a more common type where I do the Fledgling into the Fledgling, so I'm getting that natural 10 rage a turn. I found Endless on it. I even added a little bit of health to help with chump blocking. I Hell Vented it, and then I had some Rail Beaters here, which are great. Both are multi-striking, so both just get all that rage, and they're both kind of tanky, so they don't need as much defensive scaling help, especially when I'm chump blocking every turn several times. That's 11 health times 2, which, in all honesty, usually represents more than 22 health because as long as they're not trampling, it's not like they're spilling the damage over past that. And just a lot of high value cards in general. But that is that build. And then another one here did the same sort of Fledgling Imp into Fledgling Imp, but of note here was I actually put the damage shield onto this. I remember putting it in later because I knew Patient was coming, and I didn't really have a great answer for it. I think I found Tiresome Climb at some point, but wasn't able to really power it up enough that I could rely on it to be my answer to Patient. But a damage shield, keep in mind, since I had 2 of these, it has to get through 2 of them with damage shield. And I also found an Impish Scholar and put damage shield on it as well. So it was never going to get to my Rail Beaters. And I had Shardtail Queen as well with Imperialist, so I could also just, blast out these imps. So that was pretty awesome. This is a nice example of a nice way to counter patient with jump blocking still. Because remember, at a certain amount of shards, he would have had definitely had trample at this amount, but trample doesn't matter if you have damage shield, right? And then another strategy is the banner clone strategy. There's a lot of units such as Rail Beater and Apex Imp that can fill the role of tank and damage dealer simultaneously. So if you find a good infusion for it and some good upgrades early, why not just Hellvent it and not even worry about trying to dedicate it to being either? It can fill both roles, right? Both these units are great at filling either role, and they can fill them both, especially Apex Imp. At a baseline, 2 of them are typically fine, especially if you found a Frenzy Stone. That's 4 strikes, and that's generally going to be good enough. And that can still combo well with Fledgling Imp, since like in the case of like Rail Beater, double Rail Beater with multi-strike with the Fledgling Imp, that's still 5 pip. You could even take a pip upgrade and get another Fledgling Imp onto the mix. And that's pretty good. You can also do overstacking with them if it's passive scaling that you have. Like Apex Imp, for example, pretty common to take a Steelworker infusion and put it into it. If you're doing that, I mean, you might as well stack 3 or 4 of them, maybe 5 of them onto a floor if you can manage it. Hellvent them up, and you're getting all of that extra armor to every single one of them, so they're all getting that rage, and it's just insane. Apex Imp is on the level of Transcendimp, in my opinion, in terms of free win. Like, it's really hard to lose with them if you know what you're doing. And yeah, even if passive scaling though isn't your option, like Apex Imp, for example, like Rail Beater doesn't really have necessarily passive scaling. It has a little bit with the melee weakness, but not really. And that's more just like, it's just always there, shall we say. It's a more than welcome. What am I saying? You can still add some forms of passive scaling, even if it isn't the main plan. Like, if you want to add just a Steelworker to the mix to help with things, that's fine. Or even an Alpha Fiend infusion, even if the Alpha and Fiend infusion isn't going to be enough, it'll help, right? Because remember, if you're copying them, often you might still only really you might not have a Fledgling Imp, you might just have like Ritual of Battle as your damage scaling. And in that case, without some sort of offensive scaling, you're not going to get that much value over whoever you put in front, and whoever you're not putting the Ritual on, right? So it's nice if you do have something like what do you call it? Alpha Fiend infusion, or like Morsel Maker infusion's another great one. Just get 6/6 every turn. Should have listed that here, but for the record, Morsel Maker works too. And Branded Warrior too. That just gives the rage to everybody. That's really nice. So a nice example. Here's an Apex Imp example. We just had 2 of them, and it had Rail Beater infused into it. That's nice because you just get the 30 armor right off the bat, which also gives you 30 rage, if you weren't aware of that. One of them had multi-strike. Would have loved to have both having multi-strike, but that's fine. I basically Hellvented it at the point it had quick, and just found Frenzy Stone later. And then we separately had the Steelworker able to give that passive armor. We had 2 of them able to do that. So this is almost like a double clone type build. And it had Alpha Fiend, which is, in this build, it probably didn't mean much. But for the record, it did add some passive offensive scaling to those units as well. Because remember, we only did have 3 hits here. There's some times we probably wanted some decent follow-up hits. And I mean, you'll see, it went to 220 shards and handled this all pretty fine, right? Yeah, that's pretty much the idea here. We obviously want to overstack here too, because there's no way we're fitting them all on one floor. So hidden passages, tiresome climbs will help with that. We also have the last stand with the consume remove to just give hilarious amounts of rage. Gem Trove is great here. This is also a volatile gauge run, so these high cost things are a-okay to add plethora of to your deck, like Ritual Battles and whatnot. Usually you'd want to cost reduce ritual battles, but it's less needed with volatile gauge. And then this is an example of like a rail beater. What I typically see is like a rail beater setup. So both have multi-strike. We scale out mainly with the Fledgling Imps. You know, it's getting that 10 rage a turn. I have 2 of them. And, you know, so on and so forth. This is, you'll notice this is actually kind of a repeat of a previous one, just to show they are, you know, these builds can overlap, right? This is essentially the same as Fledgling Imp carry, but really here, Fledgling Imp is the carry in the sense that it provides a scaling to the actual carries, which are the Morsel Maker Rail Beaters. So they get that passive scaling through both that and the wide scaling through Fledgling Imp. And then here's a fun one, where Steelworker was the clone. Mainly it's these 2 that were the good ones, this one with the Branded Warrior and Quick Infusion, so they're quick so they can get those slays before the Echo Right and the other Steelworker get their strikes in, so they have their rage at that point. And I also had a Alpha Worker, shall we say. That one's not as good as this one, but it was a better tank just because I had the Large Stone. But, you know, we're getting a ton. We had the Rail Hammer, so, you know, if we just had a ton of armor every turn from these banner clones. This also, by the way, is redundant with the overstacking strategy. So, again, they overlap. Now, I only had the 1 hidden passage here, so it was a little tough, actually, to pull this off, but it was a little bit easier with the aid of Cheater's Hand. And had Ritual of Battles to help get those first slays. Once you start getting slays, though, with the Branded Warrior, you're pretty much getting enough rage to the entire floor. And this is just the final few sections here to close it out. You know, so everything I listed, that's what I say is the bread and butters. But, you know, as I said, there's endless amounts of possibilities. If you take those as your baseline, you can expand out and just be creative. A lot of runs, I just do something completely new that I've never done before. Like this one, I made a nice discovery that Branded Warrior with the Molten Imp infusion actually is super fun. You know, you get that, you play them down and you get that 15, whatever damage to the entire floor, and those slays count as slays. So if I get those slays with that, it actually does give rage to the entire floor. And I kind of ran out of space here, but the Hornbreaker Prince was full brawler here. I had multi-strike on the Branded Warrior, but honestly, in a lot of the cases, I just let him die out in front of Hornbreaker Prince, and so I could keep replaying him with the primitive molds, and then just keep getting that slay basically and rage to everything. And then if it was sitting there, it could still, you know, get slays through the multi-strike. And then you know, still had the Molten Encasement Fledgling Imp combo on Endless with the Burnout. That's like one of the best bread and butters you can get. And then the Transcendimp didn't have any infusions, so we didn't get to do the Abandon thing, but we still had an Endless with Burnout, so it was still quite good, and I still Hellvented it as such. And then final build we'll go over here is Banner Unitless build. They're fun. So no Banner Unit. I have no priority units, but I 5 times duped a multi-striking draft that had a Wickless Baron infusion in it. So, you know, it just has a ton of, it has some passive scaling, while also getting, you know, I have this Molten Encasement on Molten Encasement to really stack Burnout. We also had passive scaling from the Fade's first Blade. And then I had the Transcendent with the Impish Scholar, which could return basically hallowed drippings, or Infinite Box, which, you know, that's going to be pretty nice. A lot of times I can get some Rage Imps, then that starts to power up the Transcendent. I also had another hallowed drippings without the consume, so that I could be guaranteed to just keep playing that one at least. And then at that point, Fade's first Blade has given a lot of rage to these drafts, and you know, if they do burn out, there's always Primitive Mold to bring them back, and I had a pretty powerful vent. So yeah, just a nice example of a Banner Unitless build. The true carry here is still the Brawler Hornbreaker Prince, but these drafts are just kind of here as like really big meat shields in front, but they're never really gonna. You never. Once I had this Molten Encasement going on Endless with 4 stealth a turn, really you don't really have to worry about meat shields at that point. They're just there to help with the waves, and there's no boss that's gonna kill you when you have that much stealth. That's gonna do it for this. This is the completion of the Hellhorned guide. Let me know what you thought of it. I know it's pretty long, but I don't know. I don't find this game is necessarily that simple. So to me, it doesn't come. It never came easy to me. This game has never really come easy to me. I know it has come easy to a lot of people, but I don't think it comes easy to a lot of people. And that's really who I really try to gear things toward, is people like myself, I guess, who kind of need everything spelled out to really start to have the light bulb click. So that's my biggest goal, I think, is just to get that light bulb to click if you're stuck in a rut and whatnot. There's obviously way better players than me at this game that have very, very intricate strategies that will always be better than this. But I think this can get you off the ground running. You know, just to reiterate, I published my data, and it's, you know, I'm sitting at about a 75% win rate with Hellhorned at Covenant 25, and that's without reloads. There's probably a few reloads in there from the early months, but you know, in the last few months, I've committed to no reloads. So I think I'm at least qualified to hopefully help out. Yeah, I'm kind of rambling at this point, rambling Rod over here. So that's gonna do it. Thanks for watching, and as always, peace.